the night of August 20th, 1862, and Don Bosco told his boys of another dream. He found himself standing in a vast field. Vast. And off in the distance were dozens and dozens of boys. They were playing all sorts of games, many varieties of games, jumping, running, wrestling. A stranger approached him. "Ooh, come with me, I wish to show you something." Don Bosco was reluctant at first, but eventually he followed the man. The stranger took him to the edge of the field. There, tall grass all around. "Look into the grass. See what is in there." Don Bosco peered through the grass. He looked and saw an enormous, hideous snake. Must have been 20 feet in length. He pulled back. "What is this?" he said. "Look closer. See what it is." "No, you've got to be kidding. That thing could leap at me, devour me in an instant. I'm not going near it." "Fine. Then wait here." The stranger went off and got a rope. He brought the rope back and gave one end to Don Bosco. "Hold this tightly with both hands. I'll take the other end. We'll stretch it over the snake. We'll snap it." "At the snake? You're crazy. To do that, the thing could leap up and devour both of us." "No, trust me. It won't harm us at all." So Don Bosco did as he was asked. He took the rope and held it in both hands tightly, firmly planting his feet in the ground. The stranger then took the other end of the rope. He took that end of the rope and stretched it tightly over the back of the snake, holding it very firmly. And then he snapped it at the snake. Well, the snake immediately reacted, jumped up at the rope. It found itself entangled in the rope as if a noose had formed. And there it was, in that rope, writhing back and forth, flailing all around, trying to get free. And as it was doing this, it cut itself to pieces and lay there on the ground, dead. Well, by now, the boys had come from the field where they were playing, and they gathered around to watch what was going on. The stranger then said, "Watch what happens next." He took the rope from one end where he had tied it to a tree, he untied it, and then he took the other end of the rope from Don Bosco, and he rolled it up, and he put it in a box, and he closed the lid. And then he opened it and showed everybody who was there. They saw that the cord had formed the words, "Ave Maria, Hail Mary." "What does this mean?" said Don Bosco. "Explain this to us." "The snake," said the stranger, "represents the devil. The cord or the rope represents the Ave Maria, or the Rosary. You see, when we pray the Rosary, it's a powerful tool, a powerful weapon. With it, we can strike, conquer, and destroy all of hell's demons. It is powerful." By now, Don Bosco, nodding and agreeing and amazed by this, pleased that his boys had seen this fantastic example. Then his heart broken as he turned and looked and saw the boys themselves were now picking up the snake meat from the ground, the poisonous snake meat, and they were eating it. And as each of them did, their bodies hardened up like stone and they fell to the ground. He turned to one of the boys. He grabbed him and shook him by the shoulders. "What are you doing? Why do you do this? You can't eat this. Look what it's doing to you all." The boy turned to him. "Because it tastes good, Father. It tastes good. It's delicious." Don Bosco, in a bit of a panic, turned to the other priests that were there with him. "Quick, do what you can. Do what you can to help these boys not eat this meat." But sadly, he noticed that some of the priests themselves, they too were eating the snake meat, and they too were hardening like stone and falling to the ground. Why are they doing this? Why do they do this? Why are they eating this snake meat when it's poisonous and they see what's happening to them? The stranger replied, "Because the sensual man does not perceive the things that are of God. Sensual man does not perceive the things that are of God." "Well, what can I do? What can I do to help them?" "You must administer the anvil and the hammer." "The anvil and the hammer? What am I to hit these boys with a hammer? Lay their bodies over an anvil and beat them? What do you mean by that?" "No," he said. "Don't you understand? The anvil and the hammer represent the sacraments of confession, penance, and of Holy Communion. You must administer these sacraments to free them from the bonds, to break the chains that hold them." Don Bosco did exactly that. He went to each of them as quickly as he could. He began to administer the sacraments of confession and Holy Communion, even to the priests. One by one, so many of them began to come back to life. The stone-like figure they had fallen into became healthy flesh once again. But some of them did not. These were the ones who made bad confessions. These were the ones who went to the sacrament of confession or to receive Holy Communion with hearts very far from God. Don Bosco seemed to be standing in a pulpit in a church, and the pews were filled with the boys from his oratory. And they were waiting for him. They were waiting for him to begin preaching a sermon. He wasn't sure what he was going to say. And then suddenly the walls of the church and all the boys disappeared. Don Bosco found himself standing in an immense valley, lush and green. He wasn't sure what to do. He thought to himself, I'll walk for a while and see if I can find someone who can tell me where I'm at. So he began to travel through this lush valley, and very quickly he came upon a magnificent palace. It was covered with balconies and broad terraces and a glorious landscape all around. In front of the palace was a very large plaza. And off in the corner were a group of boys. They were gathered around a most beautiful lady. Don Bosco watched and saw as this lady was giving to these boys something. He moved closer to see what it was. It was a handkerchief. A handkerchief. Each boy was receiving a handkerchief. They would then take the handkerchief and they would walk up some steps, and they began to arrange themselves, lining up on a terrace. He drew closer to the lady to discover more. He overheard, as she gave the handkerchief to each boy, she was telling them something. She said to them, "Do not unfold this in the wind. If you find yourself surprised by the wind, then quickly turn to the right, never to the left." Don Bosco saw as each boy received a handkerchief, and then they all walked up these steps and joined the line on the terrace and stood there in silence. And then one boy unfolded his handkerchief. His example was seen by the others, and eventually one and then another, and pretty soon all of them did the same thing. They unfolded their handkerchiefs and they held them out. It was a beautiful handkerchief that each of them had. It was made of a fine linen and embroidered in gold. And written on each handkerchief were the words, "Queen of Virtues." Suddenly, a breeze blew from the north, or rather, from the left. It was gentle at first. Some of the boys immediately folded up their handkerchief and hid them. Others were caught by this. They left them out for a while, and then turned to the right. But others kept their handkerchief out. The breeze very quickly grew in force and became a wind, and the wind grew to become a storm. These boys continued to hold their handkerchiefs out in this storm. Well, dark clouds gathered in the sky, covering the sky. Lightning flashed. A terrible thunder rolled across the heavens. These boys unbelievably kept their handkerchiefs wide open out and feeling the full blast of this storm as rain and snow and hail pelted them and beat them mercilessly into a pitiful shape. Don Bosco was shaken by this, stunned. He went over to the lady She was surrounded by a group of men who stood as knights to protect her. He asked the question, Explain this to me. What does all this mean? The lady, upon hearing the question, turned to Don Bosco and asked, Did you not see what was written on the handkerchiefs? Well, yes, I did, my lady. It said, Queen of Virtues. The lady looked deep into the eyes of Don Bosco and asked him, Do you understand now what this means? Yes. Yes, I do. The handkerchief represents purity. All of the boys had exposed their purity to the temptation of the world, as most of us do in the world. The boys who realized the danger and fled immediately were those who folded up the handkerchief and hid it. Now, those who were caught by surprise and were not able to fold up the handkerchief but turned to the right represent those who turned quickly to prayer and by doing so turned their back on the enemy. But those who kept their handkerchief out in the open and received the full blast of the temptation are those who gave in and eventually fell into the sins of impurity. Saddened by this sight, by the realization of how many people give in to these sins of impurity, Don Bosco burst into tears. When he was able to regain his composure, he turned to one of the men and asked him, Tell me, when it comes to the drops of rain, the simple drops of rain or the snowflakes, don't these represent venial sins? Why were these so damaging to these handkerchiefs? The man turned to Don Bosco and said, When it comes to matters of purity, there is nothing that is not considered grave. But do not lose heart. Do not be discouraged. Come and see something. He led Don Bosco to the edge of the balcony, and with a sign of his hand, he called attention to all the boys. Right about face, he shouted. Many of the boys turned quickly to the right, and by doing so, their handkerchief was healed. There were patches sewn on them, though they did not ever again regain their original shape. God forgives, nature punishes. These boys, explained the lady, had the misfortune of losing their purity by falling into sin. But they regained God's grace through the sacrament of confession. The other boys who did not budge, who did not turn, were the ones who did not respond to the call of God's mercy. They remain in an obstinate way. They are stubborn in sin. They persist in a sinful lifestyle. And if they do not change their ways, they risk eternal damnation. Don Bosco found himself sitting in his office. He was working. There was an aggressive knock on the door. He went to the door and opened it, and standing on the other side of it was his mother. This surprised him, since his mother had passed away several years before. Mother, what is it? How is it that you're here? Son, you must come quickly and see something. Mother, what is it? Is everything all right? Son, you need to come and see something. Please, come, hurry. Don Bosco ran through the door, down the hallway, and around the corner, and to the balcony. And there, looked out onto the field where all the boys from the oratory were at. Up in the distance, he saw something that shocked him. It was an enormous elephant out there in the middle of the field, among all the boys, just slowly meandering around through the crowd, and dozens of boys surrounding it. Surprised by this, and wanting to investigate further, Don Bosco quickly ran down the stairs and burst out through the doors to the outside to see for himself and more up close what was happening. Some of the boys ran to the elephant out of curiosity, gathering around it. The elephant began to meander and lumber back and forth among the boys, nuzzling some of them with its trunk. Some of the boys began to incorporate the elephant into their games, and they led it around. It was tame, gentle, almost like a pet that had been raised there at the oratory. But not all of the boys were so intrigued by this elephant. Some of them, in fact, moved away, very uncomfortable by it. Others still ran from it. And there were even some who ran into the church seeking protection. Don Bosco, too, went into the church, going through a small door on the side, and as he did, he passed a statue of Our Lady. He kissed his hand and touched the mantle of Our Lady's statue, asking for protection from Our Lady as he went into the church to talk to the boys about what had been going on outside. It was at that very moment that the bells began to ring to inform them all that it was time for church services. The boys filed in from the field, filling up the pews of the church. Don Bosco had no time now to speak to them about what had been going on. He needed to go to the sacristy and vest and prepare. So he walked down the side aisle of the church, and as he did, he watched as the boys continued to file in. And in the back of the church, he noticed that the elephant had come in as well. It positioned itself in the center aisle and waited calmly for everything to begin. And when Vespers and the sermon were over, Don Bosco moved to the altar to prepare for benediction. And at that moment, when the Blessed Sacrament was raised high in the air, and all the boys there in the church were kneeling and bowing in reverence and adoration, the elephant too was kneeling, with his back to the altar. When everything was over, Don Bosco hurried to try to get outside to see what was going to happen next. But he was held up by someone. By the time he was finally able to get out the door, the side door of the church, which opened to the field where all the boys were at, he noticed that the boys had once again gathered out there, and with them was the elephant. The elephant was still gentle and tame, began to play along with the boys once again as they would lead it around. One of the boys raised up a banner. It was large and had letters sewn into it that read, "Holy Mary, help your forlorn children." Well, when this banner was raised up, all the boys gathered in line and began to march all around the field behind this. They gently pulled the elephant in to their procession. Suddenly, and without warning, this enormous animal turned on them all. This monstrous beast that once was so gentle, so calm, began to charge around the field in an uncontrolled frenzy. It lunged at the boys, and then it grabbed boy after boy, wrapping them in its trunk, flung them into the air and slammed them to the ground. And then it trampled them, pounding them under the weight of its obscene size. Bodies were crushed, bones broken. Most of them were running for their lives. Desperate cries of pain were rising up and filling the air as the rampage of this demonic elephant continued. Victims lay all over the field. You could hear the sounds of excruciating pain coming from the wreckage of these devastated lives. All the boys were wounded, some worse than others. Even those who were horribly mauled remained alive, though barely able to move. They didn't have the strength to even drag themselves off the field. Adding to the trauma of this horrible event was the fact that some of the boys there on the field were actually helping the elephant seek out new victims. They were not being harmed by the beast. They had, in fact, joined in the animal's chaos and destruction. Meanwhile, Don Bosco stood there just outside the door of the church and watched all of this unfold before him. By his side was a small statue of the Blessed Mother. And in an instant, in a miraculous moment, the statue grew to life size, and the arms of Our Lady were raised up, and her mantle unfurled like a sail. She saw the boys out there running, scared, terrified by this event, and she called out to them all, "You all, come to me! All of you, come to me!" Some of the boys instantly ran towards her, seeking the protection of her mantle, but some of them did not. Some of the boys continued to run around in chaos and pain throughout the field. She saw this. She continued to plead with them, calling all of them to come to her to seek protection. Gradually, little by little, fewer and fewer boys responded to her call. The elephant continued its slaughter with the help of those boys who ran around wielding one or two swords in their hands. These boys did all that they could to be a distraction, an obstacle, to prevent their friends, their peers, from running to the Blessed Mother. They did all they could to continue to hurt their companions there. Upon realizing this, and seeing so many victims lying out there wounded in the field, the Blessed Virgin turned to some of the boys who had sought the protection and safety of her mantle, and she directed them, sent them out on rescue missions to find those wounded souls and bring them to her, to seek the protection and the safety and the healing of her mantle. One by one, boy after boy went out to bring back their wounded friends, armed only with a club, and they risked their very lives, using their bodies to shield their friends from the vicious attacks of the elephant and those wicked companions. This went on and on and on until nearly every victim out there had been rescued. The field was now deserted, except for a few boys that lay around nearly dead. An eerie silence hung in the air. Every now and then you could hear the painful moans of those victims that could not be reached. At one end of the field, Don Bosco stood with dozens of boys, huddled close to the Blessed Virgin. They had found safety under her mantle, each of them still recovering from this frightening experience. They looked on with uneasy anticipation. They watched and waited to see what the elephant would do next. At the other end of the field was the elephant. It paced back and forth like a caged animal, looking as though it could strike at any moment. Every few seconds it would pull up and stomp its front feet on the ground in an act of defiance and rage. It was surrounded by a dozen or so boys, still wielding their swords and waving them in the air, a look of malicious intent in their eyes, and on their faces an angry yet confident grin. Suddenly, rearing up on its hind legs, this enormous elephant, which had caused so much destruction and chaos, changed into a repulsive, long-horned, ghost-like figure. It cast down a black net over all the boys that were there, and then, like the hand of hell, that net closed on those boys in an instant. The beast let out a guttural, horrifying cry, and all were enveloped in a thick cloud of smoke, and the earth split open right before them. As the sounds, the terrifying screams of those boys, combined with the demonic cry of the beast, filled the atmosphere, all of them were pulled into that gaping hole, and the split in the earth closed. All was quiet now. After a brief silence, the Blessed Virgin, seemingly exhausted from so much pleading with the boys, spoke. You heeded my call, and you were spared the slaughter wrought by the devil on your companions. Do you know what caused their ruin? Obscene conversation and immoral deeds. And those peers of yours that you saw wielding the swords, these are the ones around you every day who seek your eternal damnation. They do not care for your souls. They do not think of your salvation. She comforted the boys. She calmed them. And then she left them with these words. Go in peace, she said to them. And remember, avoid all foul conversation, all obscene talk. Run far and fast from all of those who do not resist Satan. Have boundless trust in me. My mantle is always your safe refuge. And always, always trust in the mercy of my Son.